You can see my screen. Okay, good. This is not going to work. Okay, wait a minute. Let's see what I can do here. You know what? I've been trying to figure out a way where I can see you and my PowerPoint slide at the same time. So what I would ask you is if you have any questions, unmute yourself, and then I think you come up on my screen. Okay, so are there any other announcements or any other questions before we continue with the lecture? Okay.
Quiz.
So okay, go ahead.
What quiz were you referring to? The logical fallacy practice one?
No, the logical fallacy practice quiz. No, that's in the discussions, isn't it?
For me, it's
it's in the quizzes.
It's in the quizzes.
And what quiz are you referring to that's due before Monday?
So every week there is a reading quiz, which is, I think, worth 200 points or 400 points or something like that, that's due the Monday morning. So every Monday morning there's a reading quiz due, and it's over the lecture from the previous week and the reading from the future week, for the week to come. Because I want everybody to do all the reading by Monday, because it's not gonna be, we're gonna talk about this reading on Monday and this reading on Wednesday. We're really gonna be talking about how these readings speak to one another over the entire course of the week. So I want everybody sort of up to date on the reading by Monday morning before class. So there's maybe a 10 question, could be a 20 question, so then you have more chances to get at least 70%, but you get full credit if you get at least 70% of the questions right, which might be 7 questions. And they're open note, open book, open internet, because they're the answers are in the reading, but you have a limited time, so it's 30 minutes, and every student will get a different selection of questions because there's multiple questions per. So like question number 1 for you could be 1 of 5 questions, and then question number 2 is 1 of 5. So everybody's really kind of getting a different reading quiz, and that's like, it's not worth very much. Then there's quizzes that are not reading lecture quizzes, but they're just called quizzes. And there's 4 of them over the semester. And the quiz is in the 3rd week. It'll probably be Friday of the 3rd week, but you have to come to class to get it exactly. And you'll have sort of 24 hours to do it. And again, every student is going to get a different selection of questions, but they're open note, open book, open internet, because the answers aren't in there. And it's this coming quiz that's going to be in the 3rd week. It's worth 1,000 points, and you don't have to take it. If you want to focus on some other, the project or the critical thinking exercise or some other thing, then you don't have to take it. But and you get, it's worth 1,000 points. So if you get an 89, it's worth 890 points to you. And that quiz is going to be, those quizzes are meant to be kind of bridging knowledge and synthesis. So in this particular quiz, you're going to be categorizing the statements. This statement is normative. This statement is causal. This statement is interpretation. So it's multiple choice, where all the multiple choice answers are causal, normative, interpretation, and fact, or X, some statement that's not one of those. And you'll have 24 hours to do it, like the Friday of the 3rd week of class. And when we have quizzes, we won't have class. So then you can do it during class time if you want to. But, so is that clearer?
Yeah, are you gonna post the reading check quiz tonight?
I'm going to post it. I'm hoping to post it by this afternoon. You know, I'm going to try to post it every Friday afternoon. because I have to finish the lecture and make sure it covers what I actually said in class. And this particular lecture and reading quiz is over week 1 reading, week 2 reading, and my lecture from this week. And by the way, I don't know if you guys noticed that you don't have to come to the synchronous class. You are not penalized in any way. And I have been posting the Zoom lectures on Canvas along with the PowerPoint slides. So I don't want to fault anybody for having a bad internet that day or having a bad day, or, you know, you can go listen to the lectures again if you want to. But they're all posted on Canvas in the course outline, you know. So I'll post it sometime this afternoon. Is that good? Are there any other questions?
I have a question about, so if this coming Monday, the reading quiz covers week 1 and week 2 readings, then the following Monday, is it going to cover week 3 readings? And then, so we're supposed to have the week's readings done ahead of time?
Correct. Correct, because in our discussions, you know, I don't duplicate the readings in my lectures. I've never done that as a professor. I never say, okay, we're going to talk in detail about the reading Barnett about natural right and natural law. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, so if you've read the Barnett essay about natural right and natural law, and you've read my essay with Professor Fitzgerald on how to teach students, what do those two things have in common? Are they consistent or inconsistent? So in order to have that discussion, you have to have done all of that reading, because, you know, for the exams, you're going to be thinking about how these readings speak to one another. What is logically consistent or inconsistent across the readings? And so I want to be able to prepare you for that from my lectures. And I think it's, I guess it depends on the course, but I think it's too bad when professors come and summarize the readings for students during lecture. It's like they ought to speak to one another. There ought to be some overlap, but you know, I'm hoping to give added value beyond what the readings are giving you. So, yeah, so the next, in 10 days or whatever that is, the following Monday, it's week 3 readings and week 2 lecture. And that's the way it'll be for the rest of the semester.
So pretty much like weekly, the homework, everything's due like Sunday night to Monday morning.
Right.
Cool.
Right. And you could do it at any time, except for the reading lecture quizzes, because I have to write them and update them, you know, so that you have kind of Friday and then Monday morning or the weekend to do it. Right, because the discussion is due Sunday night. The study group, if you did your study group, just a quick sentence, doesn't even have to be a complete sentence, discussion about what you and your group did outside of class. Yeah, all that's due Sunday night, I think. But because the reading lecture quiz is not available until Friday afternoon, you know, I want to give some non-weekend time because I don't want to ruin your life entirely. I laugh. I'm not laughing about ruining your life. I'm trying not to ruin your life, but teach you at the same time. So.
Wait, one more time. What are the quizzes due on Monday? Sorry.
11 a.m. And it closes. And if you don't get to it, it's not that big of a consequence on your grade. But I'm hoping you kind of figured out, like, if you really just want to see and you don't want to be bothered with any of the rest of this, you can basically, I think you can get a C- just doing the discussions and reading quizzes. I think. because you only need 12,000 points to get a C minus. And you really don't have to, maybe you have to do the quizzes, reading a lecture quizzes, discussion, and or study group. So, and let me know if you have any feedback. Like, it would really help if the discussion were due on Monday, or say, I'm flexible. I'll just change things if you'd like me to. So just email me or say it now, or, you know, have a discussion with your group and say, we're going to draw straws to who's going to tell Vanessa Baird that her class is, you know, not helpful in X, Y, or Z way. I love hearing feedback about that stuff, because I try my hardest, and there's always things I don't think of. And I've never done a class like this, ever. And maybe you've never done a class like this either. And so you should just let me know if something works or doesn't work. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm hoping that you're kind of aware that using the incorrect kind of evidence for a particular kind of argument is a logical fallacy. And it's one that doesn't get discussed very often, because it's just not one of the ones that people are tuned into. But I'm super tuned into it, because you can't use data to provide evidence for an interpretation argument. Your understanding of Supreme Court politics doesn't help you interpret what is covered by the right to privacy, right? And we gloss over that a lot. I mean, I'm hoping that with, you know, looking at all this, looking at all these materials, then when you read a news article about the Trump campaign did this, or Biden did that, or whatever, you'll notice, oh, there's a logical fallacy there, you know. I mean, what's a logical fallacy that is often used in political campaigns? Well, all of them, you know, in one way or another. And I'm not being critical of them. For instance, one thing that you noticed in these logical fallacy videos, which I hope you found entertaining and fun, is that it's okay to make it appeal to emotion, as long as you're making it clear that you're making it appeal to emotion, right? And that's what political campaigns do. They're meant to make you feel something, right? And there's nothing wrong with feeling something when it comes to politics. In fact, Adam Smith wrote a book called The Theory of the Morality of Emotions. And he talks about, is it immoral to feel a particular emotion when you are confronted with a particular argument or evidence or an event or something like that? And that argument appeals to me, because I think, you know, responding with a lack of empathy to the news is probably immoral, you know? So, you know, but on the other hand, like, if I'm going to appeal to your emotion, I'm going to say, right now, I'm going to appeal to your emotion. And then I appeal to your emotion, and then I finish with that. And I say, now let's engage with the evidence or the argument or the text or whatever it is, you know? So, all right, so let's talk about the different kind of fallacies. I just want to make sure that everybody sort of understands them. Straw man fallacy. Do I hate that one the most? Maybe I hate that one the most, because if you're going to be intellectually honest with your argument, then you better take serious care of what the strongest arguments are against what you're arguing. You know, so for instance, the biggest compliment I ever got in my about my book was, I don't believe anything you're arguing here, is what my colleague told me. I just don't buy it. But I have never seen anyone try to prove their argument wrong more than you have. And I was like, I'm winning! You know, this is like the best compliment I could ever get. So, you know, that's one that I hope to take seriously, and I hope to teach you to take it seriously, you know, as much as possible. So when you present the other side as a bunch of idiots, then that's not really helpful, you know, in sharpening the your own argument. So you know, when I assign papers, and you can write a paper in this class if you want to, I give a D. Well, first of all, I give an F for an argument. For a paper without an argument, you just get a 0. I give a 0 for making the wrong kind of argument. If I've asked you to tell me what the law is and you tell me what the law should be, you get a 0, right? And you get a D if you have no serious counter argument. So if you've got a straw man in your paper, that's immediately a D. So you've got to really think super clearly about both sides of the argument. Are the Blaine Amendments constitutional or not? You better have a really clear vision of yes, they are, and no, they're not, before you write your paper, because you've got to really present the best arguments. And I say an A paper is one that presents the strongest counter argument, you know. So that's why I kind of hate that one the most, because it's one that doesn't take the other side seriously, you know. Can anyone think of an example in the news media of a straw man fallacy? One that wasn't talked about in the video?
I think in like political coverage a lot, candidates' views are misrepresented. This commonly happens, you know. You'll see a Republican say, "Well, I believe in cuts to social programs," and not the moderator, but the person arguing against them will say, "Well, I guess you just don't care about poor people."
Exactly, right? Insults are great straw mans. Well, you know, that shows that Republicans are immoral, or what, you know. Those are great straw mans, you know, where they overshoot. You know, Obama is a communist. It's a straw man argument. It's also an ad hominem argument. And I would venture to say that virtually 100% of the people who say that don't understand what communism is. Or Trump is a fascist. You know, these are insults, and it turns on the definition of fascism, and it's you know, those aren't helpful. So really taking serious care for what the other side is. I mean, why do lawyers need to pay attention to straw man arguments? Just as an example.
You could end up arguing the wrong idea, or a different idea from what you came in to argue.
Okay, you know, you're going to end up making a weaker argument for your client in court, right? But what happens to lawyers who don't consider the strongest arguments on the other side?
They lose.
They lose, right? They get surprised in the middle of court thinking, oh, I didn't even think of that argument, right? They get surprised. They, you know, and that's the last thing you want to happen in court. Somebody here spent the summer going to oral arguments. I forget, I don't know if that person is online here, but you know, when you listen to an oral argument at the Supreme Court, lawyers very rarely have a chance to get a complete sentence out before they're interrupted by the justices to say, well, wait a minute, what about this? Well, what about that? You know, I had a lawyer who argued in front of the Supreme Court to my class one time, who said that, you know, as soon as their case was granted cert by the Supreme Court, she had this feeling of bone cold terror, thinking, well, how am I going to make sure I am on my feet with every single argument on the other side that they're going to hit me with, you know? And oftentimes what you find is, let's say you're the lawyer advocating for a liberal side, like a pro liberty or rights, you know, against government power or against employer power or something like that, you'll often see that the most liberal justices are the hardest on their argument. Why would that be the case? Why would you see somebody like Scalia or Thomas being the hardest on the conservative side, or somebody like Ginsburg being the hardest on some kind of pro-women's rights side?
Is it because they're trying to reaffirm that they agree with you, and they're trying to have you express like why you are right, even though they already believe you're right? They're trying to persuade the other justices on why you're right.
Exactly. It's theater. Oral arguments are pure theater, you know, and they want the strongest argument presented. I mean, Justice Thomas, I went to a lecture he gave one time, and he said the very first brief he reads when he has to decide on a case is the ACLU brief, because he knows that the ACLU is putting forth the strongest brief. Justice Thomas doesn't read some of these weak-minded, conservative, nonprofit groups, you know, and they're going to write maybe they're not even lawyers, and they write an amicus brief that is, that's useless to him. He knows his own arguments. He doesn't need to review that. He wants to know what are the strongest arguments on the other side that I'm going to have to contend with, right? All right, ad hominem attacks. You know, those are you know, very often used, right? That, for example, I have required in the past in my American government class an essay written by John C. Calhoun. Does anybody know who that is? You can actually go online this morning and show, you can see the video of a statue of John C. Calhoun toppling over and being, you know, crushed. John C. Calhoun was a terrible, terrible human, and a virulent proponent of slavery. And he was a South Carolina senator from, I don't know, the 1820s to the, he died in 1850. And when he died, he said, this country will go to war over the election of a president in 10 years. That's an interesting prediction. You can see why he would have predicted that correctly. But why would I assign an essay written by a terrible human in my American government class? One explanation is I could be evil and pro-slavery. Not likely, at least I hope, you know. Why would I assign an essay written by this asshole?
So we can see an argument that we may not believe in, but it's always good to read an opposing argument and also get a full
but slavery
idea.
is good. Is
No.
Yeah, like that's not a worthwhile. Yeah. No.
I just need to get into the head of the opposing argument.
Well, that's for sure. People read Mein Kampf for that reason. It's not necessarily because they're anti-Semitic assholes that they read Mein Kampf. Maybe they want to understand.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. In this case, it happens to be, it was a very good essay. Ideas worth considering about the nature of power and the way to promote better policy by allowing constitutional protections for different sides of the argument. It happened to have nothing to do with slavery. Now you can see why his pro-slavery views caused him to write that essay, but I'm not going to assign an essay about did the Jews cause 9/11, which I've been asked to do by students. And I'm like, you know, that's not an argument we're going to be, you know, considering here. But it just happened to be a very good essay. So you could say John C. Calhoun was an asshole, so nothing he ever said could have been reasonable. And that's just not a logical, you know, that's just not a logical conclusion necessarily. No. I don't think anything Hitler ever said was worth considering. But in this case, John C. Calhoun, his essay was worth considering. You know, his version about why we should have his version of federalism and his version of the understanding of the 10th Amendment, but that's actually worth considering. And it just had nothing to do with slavery, technically speaking. You know, logically, you could look at his essay and consider it and even buy into it without ever even addressing your own views on slavery. They're just logically orthogonal. You know, they have nothing to do with one another. Just like whether you like Citizens United has nothing to do, like whether your opinion about money and politics has nothing to do with the law created by Citizens United. You could have an opinion about what the law is, and that's completely orthogonal to your opinion about what the law should be. They have nothing to do with one another. All right, so false dichotomy. Can anybody think of an example of that one?
I'm not really sure if this is an example of that one, but you know when like Biden was like, if you don't vote for me, you're not black.
Aha! That's an excellent one, right? He was super criticized for that. Now, he's criticized for that because of normative reasons, but logically, that's nonsense, right? I mean, and I don't mean to over criticize Biden, you know, because they all do these logical fallacies. I mean, why do people engage in logical fallacies, by the way? Is it because they're stupid?
Because they work.
Because they work, right? And you can think of my class as being a way to try to prevent them from working as well as they do, you know, in a sense, right? Appeals to emotion work. Ad hominem attacks work. False dichotomies work. There's a reason that people even think that way. There's even, if you get into the science of neuroscience, scientific reasons that they work, you know. Okay, so appeal to authority. Can someone give me an example of that one? I'm gonna keep my clock up here.
My cousin's a lawyer, and he says that Supreme Court ruling sucks, but his cousin is like a corporate lawyer and doesn't really know very much about constitutional law.
He says that the Supreme Court sucks.
Well, if a hypothetical cousin happened to be a lawyer and said this ruling was flawed for XYZ reasons, he has some authority on the subject, but he's a corporate lawyer. He doesn't know. This isn't his, you know, maybe he hasn't even read the ruling. He just, you know.
Almost certainly has not. I mean, nobody reads these rulings in their entirety. I read very few Supreme Court cases in their entirety. You know, but that's an interesting appeal to authority. Appeal to my own authority, right? And do you have professors that do this? Well, I'm more knowledgeable than you, right? And so that's a particularly virulent one. That's not a good one. Believe me, because I know more than you do. And especially believe me about my normative views. I have no more qualification, except for maybe I just know more Supreme Court cases than you do, but I have absolutely no more moral authority on whether Citizens United was a good ruling than you do, you know, and I don't pretend to do that, you know, I don't pretend that. A corporate lawyer might be better able to assess what the law is because they've been trained in interpretive methodologies, you know. No true Scotsman would ever say or believe that. Can you give me an example of that?
I can give an example.
Okay.
No Republican would ever support social spending.
No true Republican would ever support. What do they call those kind of Republicans? Does anybody know?
Republican in name only, Rhino.
Yeah, Republican in name only, right? Exactly. So that, you know, and that's, those are nonsense. All right. A fallacy is a good one because it's like, well, I caught you said, you know, whatever, and that's a fallacy. So you couldn't possibly be right that that's an immoral case, right? So that is a problematic one. The sharpshooter fallacy. So has anybody ever heard of confirmation bias? Okay, good. Alex? Or I don't know if you go by Alex or Alexander, but I saw you nodding. So here, I'll have to unmute you. Is it okay if I unmute you? I don't know if I'm supposed to.
There we go.
Yeah, okay.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah, tell me what confirmation bias is.
So if you have a presupposed idea about what the reality of something is, so say I am presupposed to believe that Medicare for all is the best social healthcare platform, then I will accept ideas that support that and ignore ideas that don't support that.
Right, you're less critical of your own side, you know. You can probably see how a lot of these fallacies overlap, you know, because confirmation bias is a lot like straw man arguments, right? That you're not being as critical of your own side as you ought to be, you know. And I got to tell you, that's a hard one because neuroscientifically, we are hardwired for confirmation bias in such a way that I think if you believe you're free of it, you're probably wrong. You know, I'm certainly not free of it. And I catch myself in it all the time where I try to engage in a practice of thinking about the logic or having sober second thoughts about my opinions. But it's critical thinking is not as much of a skill as it is a practice, because you can be a great critical thinker and just automatically buy arguments that are on your side of the political spectrum more easily than you'll buy the other side. And it's something that's it's very difficult to overcome. And you know, there's sort of advanced levels of confirmation bias. So I'll give you an example. There was a scientist in the 90s who was arguing that viruses can cause cancer. And every scientist laughed her out of the discipline. She quit getting grants for her research to test those hypotheses. She didn't lose her job, but nearly lost her job. And, you know, she was just laughed out. She was completely discredited. Well, what do we know now? Viruses can cause cancer, right? So everybody just automatically believed in the truth of the science that couldn't possibly be true. And now 20 years later, 25 years later, we're finding out that she had a good reason to believe that. So there can be really kind of advanced levels. We all engage in these logical fallacies, and it's very difficult to overcome them. And so it's really sort of a practice of, okay, so that idea sounds kind of outlandish. Tell me more about that, or you know, that we try to engage in thinking critically about those things. I'll give you one example. Is you guys have all heard about the spatial models, where people talk about liberalism and conservatism on a spatial way of thinking. But every political scientist will go on ad nauseum about models are not the truth. Models are models. They're not the truth. They're supposed to approximate the truth as well as they can, but they're by definition simplistic. So what I could do as a person who wants to understand political psychology is literally interview 320 million people, you know, ask them why they vote the way they do, come up with like a report that's way longer than I could do. And then you could explain every single person's vote choice, basically with their name or, you know, something, you know, but when you're trying to come up with something that's parsimonious, then it's a model. And parsimonious means it's a simplification. It's a simplification that your mother's party ID, and by the way, it's not your father's party ID, that influences your vote choice, right? Not everybody votes the way their mother voted, right? But it's a model that actually works to explain a huge proportion of people's votes, even controlling for 100 other factors. But it's not the truth. And then in the same breath, they'll be like, well, that's against the spatial model. And we know the spatial model accounts for a large understanding of political psychology or voting or campaigns. So there's a lot of things that it's relevant for. And they pretend that it's the truth. And it's a real problem in political science that, you know, people will say, well, that's inconsistent with the truth. And we know that such and such is the biggest predictor. And it's like, well, maybe you haven't thought of other things, or maybe you haven't control for every, you know, thing that you have. And so we often believe in our models way more than we should. So that's an example of that. Moving the goalpost. We don't need to talk about that one. Appeal to emotion, reverse causality. That's an interesting one. So when I teach statistics, we talk a lot about, there's a lot of correlations, and not every correlation is causation. You've heard that one probably. But then what I do is I catalog, okay, so what could the correlation be? And one thing that it could be is that it's a reverse causality, you know, that is explaining the correlation. And so appeal to nature fallacy. Can somebody give me an example of that?
Happened a lot with the homosexuality debates in 2014.
Aha, that's a good one, right? That it's somehow not natural. Now you could engage with the question on its merits, and what would somebody arguing on the side of gay marriage, how could they talk about that?
Well,
how could they engage in the nature question?
Well, it does exist in nature.
Exactly.
You
That's
can
what
find
I'm saying,
homosexual
right?
relationships. Yeah.
You know, but another thing is who gives a damn whether it appears in nature and other species or whatever, right? That has nothing to do with the moral question of should we allow that liberty, right? You know, where I see this a lot is with the nutrition, or what do they call the like this kind of hippie stuff or whatever, you know, where you're like, well, I just don't believe in chemicals. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Water is a chemical, you know, like, what do you mean by that? And so it's a way to kind of gloss over, I only want to put natural things in my body, right? Like, so the natural grocers, you know, in a sense, contains that logical fallacy. Like arsenic is in nature, E. coli is in nature, like none of these things are good, you know, for us or whatever, just because they're unnatural. If you go to the, I've already uploaded this PowerPoint slide to the to Canvas, and you can click on the fun one on logical fallacies that we see often during election season. Not required, but also fun. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about helping you do well on this quiz that's in 3 weeks. Not the reading quiz that's due Monday, but the one that's in 3 weeks, where you have to actually categorize these different kinds of statements for, is it a fact or an argument? And if it's an argument, what kind of argument is it? So I want to talk a little bit about causality, just because I've taught a lot of philosophy of science, and also statistics, and so I think really hard about causality. One thing is the concept of a scientific fact is technically an oxymoron, and what I mean by that is that technically speaking, you don't ever prove a scientific theory or prove a scientific inference. And the more provable it is, the more it's not an argument and it's not a theory. And so there are facts within the field of physics or facts within the field of geology. But calling something a scientific fact is a misapplication of the epistemology of science, which is by definition an inference, and at their higher levels, every single scientific discipline works on theories that are not proven or true. So you don't get a job as a physics professor arguing that the theory of gravity is true, right? Because we already know that one, and we can talk about like more narrow confidence intervals. So, so like when I'm at cocktail parties, because I'm kind of like Spock, I'll say, yeah, I kind of believe that policy will work, but I'm only 65% sure that's true, or whatever. I'm always estimating my confidence intervals around my beliefs. And I sort of feel like it's a feature of an educated mind to widen your confidence intervals about your beliefs. And so, thinking about making arguments where you're not 100% sure they're true. I mean, almost every single article I write, I certainly understand that they're not true, and so, and if they are true, then I don't have a job anymore, because I'm just like quoting Wikipedia or whatever. Like, verifiable facts are easy. Any fourth grader can evaluate that. Now, on the other hand, lots of people believe things that aren't true, like the world is flat, or there's all kinds of things that people don't believe that are not true. And so it's that's a new problem that I have not incorporated into my teaching, is like, well, can you believe political fact and all that stuff? So but technically, when something's a fact, it's no longer interesting. Did Booth kill Lincoln? Yes. What does that teach us about history? Nothing, right? So and I think scientific inferences are some of the most interesting inferences we can make. But to pretend that they're true, or that this is a proven scientific fact, it might be a proven fact in physics, And so I talk here about gravity is truer than climate change, which is truer than any of my theories, And I wouldn't be a good scientist if I wasn't able to be critical of my own theories, All right, so yeah. So when I say that my theories are less true, it's a compliment to myself, not a criticism. So, okay. Wanted to note that. Some other things about causality is that it's a logical fallacy to say smoking doesn't cause cancer because my uncle smoked until he was 90 and he never got cancer. Pointing out exceptions to rules do not just prove the rule. Even pointing out that there's not a correlation. There's a particular form of causality that where the things are not correlated. But that gets me off a topic. And so when you're trying to show what caused World War II, that is not a scientific inference. That's not the kind of causality that I'm talking about, because the causality that I'm talking about is trends across multiple data points. So when you talk about, well, what causes war, that can be a scientific inference, but what caused Obama to do this or that is not causality in the sense of what I'm talking about. You can't use science to show that what caused Obama to do whatever he did in a particular instance. But what causes Democratic presidents to do this or that thing, that can be a scientific inference. Yeah, and pointing out exceptions is a logical fallacy. So if you're going to evaluate a statement and you're trying to wonder if it's causal or not, you want to make sure that it's talking about more than one event or more than one person or more than one time period in order to be probabilistic causality. But the other thing you'll note is that causal statements have two concepts in them. And concepts have, it takes me 3 weeks to teach my statistics classes how to evaluate whether something is a concept or not. But concepts are things that are unidimensional, that vary from high to low, that can be measured, at least qualitatively, as more and less, or higher and lower. But they, in causal statements imply you've got to talk about two concepts. One causes the other over several units. The other thing is that it must be measured intersubjectively. So for those of you who listen to the other PowerPoint slide, what does intersubjective mean? Okay, so why don't I just tell you what it means? Intersubjective means that it's interpersonal, that it goes beyond our subjective viewpoint. So if you want to argue that 1 + 1 = 3, which actually there's a Harvard mathematician who's currently making that argument on Twitter. It's kind of a fun argument. I have a friend who's an electrical engineer who says 1 + 1 does equal 3 for high values of 1, which is just a kind of mathematical joke. But we can all look at one apple and agree that it's one apple. And it doesn't matter whether you like apples or don't like apples, you can agree this is one apple, right? That among humans, we can kind of make this agreement that about what the nature of having one is, or what the nature of having 0 is. And so if I, as many people do, measure intelligence by their party identification, I have a cousin who thinks that intelligence is measured by whether you're a Republican or not, actually whether you're a Trump voter or not, and that other people must be complete idiots, right? And that's not a definition of intelligence that is intersubjective, right? And so you can be a liberal or conservative and still agree on the definition of liberalism. You can be anti-science and still agree on the nature of what science is. Now, whether you like chocolate ice cream or not is by definition not an intersubjective kind of thing. But the more intersubjective arguments are, the better. In other words, if you're going to argue that we shouldn't eat meat by meat eaters are evil, that's not likely to bring people on the other side. But if you're making a careful argument about whether we should eat, whether it's moral to eat meat, you're going to want to think about how to make that argument as intersubjective as possible. And so Washington Post editorials are often not intersubjective on either side. either liberal or conservative. They're often not intersubjective. But you don't get a job as a philosopher by just calling the other side evil, right? So you want to think, okay, so how can I invoke first principles such that it can make my argument more convincing? And rants are by definition not intersubjective. So the rants my cousin gets into he calls liberals libtards. He's not trying to make a careful intersubjective argument, right? So but you could have an intersubjective argument for why we should vote for Trump or whatever it is. You can try your best to be intersubjective. And science is at its best intersubjective. So people who are liberal or conservative can look at the data on climate change and make an agreement, at least within some kind of range, about the nature of what's going on there, about the nature of what's causing it and all that. So at best, you should aim for your arguments to be intersubjective. Regardless of whatever kind of argument you're going to make, you aim toward intersubjectivity. All right, so I just said all that. Okay, so a note about the kinds of statements that are not classifiable. And there's a number of them, like the causality of one event or one instance or one decision just happens to not be in these 4 categories. So the interpretation of events, like, wow, the nature of politics today it's just too bad that we're arguing all the time or whatever. It's a sad time, or the parties are getting nastier and nastier than they ever have, which is kind of funny given that Jefferson called Adams a hermaphrodite. Like it was pretty nasty back then, and we fought a civil war, so it's we're not quite there, but nevertheless they often turn upon the semantics. So a great one is, well, that's racist, right? That one statement, I'm going to classify that as racist, is an interpretation of an event. And I'm not saying that can't be done well, but I can't teach you how to do that well. That's not my training, and so I don't include it in my categories. Declarations, exclamations, I like ice cream, all that kind of stuff. Those are not classifiable. So on the quiz, you might be presented with a statement that you have to just say none of the above. This is in category X. This is not in those 4 categories. All right. Some helpful hints. Interpretation, by the way I mean it, is always about the meaning of words. And so you interpret the Bible, and you interpret the Constitution, and you interpret the Citizens United case or whatever Supreme Court case, or you interpret what the meaning behind Moby Dick is, is the white whale Northern Ireland, or is it, and so then you can argue, and you can make better arguments or more persuasive arguments. But interpretation as, what you're going to be trained to do in this class is to interpret the meaning behind the words that are written in some of these Supreme Court cases. You can apply that knowledge to interpret the Bible, and you can be religious or not religious. You can be Jewish or Muslim, and you can still look at the words and hear people's arguments about the meaning of thou shalt not kill, and that kind of stuff. But you can't go outside into the world and talk about it's too bad there's so much killing and bring that into what the meaning of the Bible's words are. And so that's why it's the data are inconsistent with an interpretation argument. The other thing to note about when you're going to designate something as a fact is its verifiability. So if I say in Griswold, they say marriage is sacred, that's a fact. because they do. You know, that is what they say. And a paraphrasing or a summarizing or a direct quote, those are facts, even though it's about the text, because it's verifiable. You can go to page 23 and see if it said that, you know. And the more it gets into, well, you could argue the other side, then it becomes an interpretation. By the way, all arguments can be in their category, even if they're stupid. So in other words, if I say everyone should be forced to eat meat, that's a stupid argument, but it's still normative, right? Like, you know, and so the level of stupidity or unpersuasiveness is not important, but the level of verifiability makes it not an argument. And by definition, if something is verifiable, then it's not falsifiable. Okay, so, all right, so let's see, where are we in the day? We're about out of time in terms of the actual class. So let me just see if you guys have any questions about this. Someone, Mac, did you raise your hand? I don't know if you raised your hand, or I'm not seeing any hands. So let me just speak for a moment about next week's reading. So you're gonna read an essay by Barnett about natural law and natural right. Now, what I'd like for you to think about as you read that essay is, how is that related to all this about the statements and the nature of the different kinds of arguments? How is that, in a sense, a reification of differentiating these kinds of statements? That's the kind of question you should ask yourself as you read that essay. And the other thing to pay attention to is in Hardin's essay about what the nature of a constitution is. I want you to look at his normative assumptions and his factual assumptions. You know, I want you to look at the nature of what is he assuming about the world or about the text, and what is required for you to believe in order to understand and buy into his argument. So I want you to pay attention to that. Okay, good. Well, let me know if you want to talk to me this afternoon. I'm going to be working on the quiz, and so I should be available. And so every few minutes, I'll check my email to see if anybody wants to talk to me about anything. And then I'll stay on after now in case anybody has any more detailed questions, and kind of like a mini office hours if you'd like to stay on. But if not, have a good weekend.
Professor, I was just
Good.
wondering
Yeah,
if you
Paul.
could, yeah, hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight on if you were to attack a problem such as the reticence that violates the Ninth Amendment. Kind of what would be your framework?
Good. Ninth Amendment talk. There we go.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm just kind of struggling on where to start, because I can think of a few different angles, but I'm not really sure, you know, which one to really drill down and go for.
So one thing I was saying in some office hours I had the other day is that a lot of what we do in academia, you cannot do from your ivory tower, right? You can't just sit in your office and make inferences about the nature of the world outside your office. You have to go outside your office to look at, well, what is happening and what are the data and what are the, you know, what do we observe in the world? That is irrelevant for this essay. You can sit in a room in your ivory tower and you can do this assignment knowing nothing about the world and nothing about the Constitution. And you just look at the sentence and look up every single meaning of the word in Webster's dictionary and diagram the sentence. That's what you need to do this assignment. So you're barking up the wrong tree if you're trying to think about, well, what would the police do? What kinds of violations of liberties are there? What are the liberties and rights? So like one thing I said the other day is you could be an alien from outer space who learns English and do this assignment. You do not have to know anything about the world. Now that is not true in like my research. I have to know about the world to do the research that I do. But this assignment is a logical assignment about the nature of the words as they're written down. And so I don't know if that's helpful, but you shouldn't be imagining hypotheticals to do this assignment. What you should do is like say, okay, well, what is the subject of the sentence? And what does enumeration mean? And what does construe mean? Shall not is a little easier. But, so you want to imagine that the Ninth Amendment is speaking to you and telling you not to do something. And then you should do the opposite, and in a way, it's probably speaking to political actors, which include justices, by the way, and telling them what, how to interpret the Bill of Rights, and, I'll tell you, violations of the Ninth Amendment are all over our Supreme Court majority opinions, and some people have gone into Google Scholar and read essays about the Ninth Amendment. I don't think that's going to help you either. I don't think they say what I'm getting at in there. What they're saying is, okay, so